April 27th, 1915. Last night I salved 3 captured guns that were lying in full view of the enemy's new line, not more than 500 meters away. The moon was shining, and apart from this, the enemy kept the battlefield continually lighted up with most damnably bright very lights. We were all night on the job, constantly interrupted by furious bursts of fire and by the very lights, which obliged us to lie flat on the ground as long as they were burning. Before dawn we got all 3 guns into safety, together with their limbers and ammunition. One of my men was shot through the heart because he tried to bring back a sucking pig, which he found squeaking in its lonely pen on one of the limbers. He sat on top, while his comrades put their shoulders to the wheels. Suddenly he fell lifeless between the wheels, still holding his little pig in the grip of death. After fresh attacks, a sleeping army lies in front of one of our brigades. They rest in good order, man by man, and will never wake again, Canadian divisions. The enemy's losses are enormous. The battlefield is fearful. One is overcome by a peculiar sour, heavy and penetrating smell of corpses. Rising over a plank bridge, you find that its middle is supported only by the body of a long-dead horse. Men that were killed last October lie half in swamp and half in the yellow-sprouting beet fields. The legs of an Englishman, still encased in puttees, stick out into a trench, the corpse being built into the parapet. A soldier hangs his rifle on them. A little brook runs through the trench, and everyone uses the water for drinking and washing. It is the only water they have. Nobody minds the pale Englishman who is rotting away a few steps farther up. In Langemarck Cemetery, a hecatomb had been piled up, for the dead must have lain above ground level. German shells falling into it started a horrible resurrection. At one point I saw 22 dead horses, still harnessed, accompanied by a few dead drivers. Cattle and pigs lie about, half rotten. Broken trees, drives razed to the ground, crater upon crater in the roads and in the fields. Such is a 6-month-old battlefield. And close behind it, in the rest positions of the reserves, are miracles of order and industry. Hutments, living trains and a bath train, brought up on a specially constructed railway line. There are well-made roads that were nothing but bottomless slashings in a wood. And yet, genius is still lacking. May 7th, 1915. The French are terribly indifferent. They did not bury their dead, although they had lain for months in the trenches we have taken. The latter are carelessly planned and badly made. Our trenches are perfect drawing rooms compared to them. They even left the bodies of their officers lying about. I brought away an identity disc as a curiosity and a proof of this. It strikes one as strange that an officer 46 years old should be killed in the front line and not brought back. Unfortunately, I could not make out his rank and regiment. Even where they have buried their dead, they take care that the graves should soon be indistinguishable from the rest of the ground. They are marked with a little cross not more than 2 hands high, generally 2 twigs bound together. But I seldom saw any names, if the French government were minded. To issue no casualty lists, they could write missing against the names of all the dead who could not be located, thereby encouraging the idea that all these missing men are prisoners of the Germans, and then a shrug of the shoulders. In any case, it is very noticeable how many German graves one finds and how few French ones. Only he who seeks carefully finds traces and effaced proofs that their losses were probably as heavy as ours. Vifweges, May 16th, 1915. One of our attacks beaten back with losses, and what is worst of all, the men have got sticky with the losses and cannot be got out of the trenches for the attack. The officers are stout lads, but lack the proper training and ability, and can no longer get them forward. I cannot altogether blame the men. The fault lies in their lack of personal authority. I would probably not get out of a trench into heavy fire myself if one of them ordered me to do so. May 21, 1915. We have been attacking again, success nil, heavy losses, including many officers again. The men see that they are not out for a big purpose, only for a trench, and they are no longer willing to sacrifice themselves for that. What is the use, I ask? This is pure dilettantism. I say this not secretly but openly for anyone who cares to hear it. Yesterday the idea of waving the green flag of the Prophet from our trenches was seriously debated. in order to induce the African troops to desert. Just like fourth form schoolboys. May 23rd, 1915. A Pentecost that could not be more Pentecostally imagined. The world dances in sunlight, and a mild wind rolls the smell of blossoms and sweet scents in clouds across the land. The horses are neighing and kicking. Nightingales are singing, and before us lies the war. He demands that all this should make way for him. June 28th, 1915. I am in Berlin, buying horses. At the front one met people who had come from Berlin, and who said that one could not see any signs of a war there. They must be blind. Certainly it would be foolish to produce bread cards as the only outward and visible sign of the war. The fact that there are many soldiers about would not in itself be characteristic, but what soldiers one sees, where one sees them, and how. Did you ever meet a private soldier in Unter den Linden in peacetime? It is full of them now. Not very warlike in their clothing, carriage, and appearance, many of them wounded, all of them feeling and acting as the chief personage of the drama, as well they may be. They are of all ages. They are a proof of how deeply fate has dug into our lives. The traffic in the streets is different, very different. There are cabs and cars, trams, pedestrians and cyclists indeed. But all this is concentrated in a few main arteries. The rest are practically bloodless. There are crowds in the pubs, hotels, expensive restaurants, and the Unter den Linden. But the quiet parts are quieter than ever. The shops, too, those that are to be seen. Who wants to buy a piece of furniture, a carpet, a wallpaper, a sporting gun, a shirt, a walking stick, yes, even a girl of the streets? Not to speak of arts and industry, fine craftsmanship, building and public works. This is a very vivid impression. Another thing is worthy of note, that the banks close from 12:30 till 3. I had to stand up all the way from Cologne to Brussels because the train was packed. Met UR, who gave a delightful description of the German poets assembled in Brussels under the aegis of Walter Bloem. West Flanders, July 17th, 1915. Concerts are being given in Roulers for the troops who have been well knocked about in the line and are back in rest billets. But though I was longing for music, and the singers came from the best opera companies in Germany, although they did their best, one could not enjoy the music properly. I don't know whether this was because of the striking discord between the growl of the guns and the songs, which were mostly about young love, lime trees, sleeping children, and the like. I don't think so. For when one man sang a bad war ballad by Lowe, I could not get any nearer to it, well as it sounded, than to Brahms's Young Love. Finally, I was more unpleasantly moved than pleasantly by this effort to introduce anything but war. Others may have felt differently. They seemed to be delighted, but I know that they liked to be given the unaccustomed illusion of peace. Kirchhoff sang, "Lord, let us conquer," or something of the sort. At the end there was great enthusiasm, so far as one could judge by the clapping and the cries of "Bravo." But it seemed to me that something was being forcibly crammed into these souls that did not belong there. To August 5th, 1915. The war is changing for me. Perhaps this happens to everyone sooner or later. For the last few weeks I no longer look to him alone as to the only Lord of us all, claiming on unwilling allegiance. I think of you too. Not that I had forgotten you, but you were more inside me and with me. Now I feel that you are something behind me, that I had to leave at home, and that I must now worry about from a distance. For this reason I think of peace too. But I say with truth that this is not the only reason. The war itself gradually brings the warrior round to this point of view. This is not a summit, but rather an end at which one arrives. Here on the Western Front the war has lost all its dash. It is so devoid of resiliency and so bloodless that the blood which still flows daily seems like a sign of old age, where the blood oozes through the brittle walls of the veins. The fact that regimental bands are being formed to entertain officers and men, that one keeps up a continual chit-chat of formal and unnecessary correspondence, these are bad signs. The corps commander unveiled a monument to the dead of his corps, which the town of Roulet was ordered to erect in the middle of the cemetery. Deputations from every unit were ordered to attend. The orders went into detail to the extent of directing that each deputation was to bring 3 bouquets. Bands were playing, representatives of other corps and sundry generals were asked, and this took up the whole morning and half the afternoon. If we look towards the enemy's front, it seems to be even duller. French is doing nothing whatever. One can imagine him following a routine something like this. He starts the morning by smoking his pipe for 2 hours, then an hour and a half on his hunter, at a walk, varied from time to time by a nice steady canter. Then a wisely ordered and comfortable breakfast. Then running foolishly to and fro for a couple of hours, which he calls exercise. Any old field glass is good enough to see his officers actually doing this every day. After this, he disappears into a bomb-proof dugout to read a number of newspapers. Then he has a quiet hour before lunch, followed by a little light conversation over a whiskey and soda. In the afternoon, he sends forth a report of about 6 lines, as he really does not like writing. Then it is tea time, and the end of the day is in sight. He is typical of the lack of imagination that is the worst vice of a commander. But you need only translate the English expressions into German, with the exception of a few peculiarly English customs, and the picture will portray our side of the line just as well. To come back to our own side, it is hard to say whether it is a symptom of insignificant or empty leadership that we have had quite a number of deserters during the period of idleness. 3 Alsatians deserted a short time ago. We have a good many of them in our regiments. Perhaps the war has had only an indirect effect in this case, the lack of more warlike occupation allowing the NCOs to be unpleasantly attentive to these elements. At any rate, people in their regiment say that it is no wonder, since they were so maltreated. The German NCO does not know the difference between the use of influence and brutality. Whether he has to deal with subordinates in his own capacity, or with the public in that of a policeman, or with a horse as its rider, does not matter. He ill-treats them. The broken-spirited horse, the sulky public are the results, but he does not know it. He finds the broken horse well ridden in, the deserter has not been knocked about enough, and the sullen public requires further training. So these 3 Alsatians deserted, gave away the position of the trenches in the sector they knew, and brought a well-prepared bombardment, an infantry attack, and some losses upon our troops. One asks, why did they serve a year with us, share our victories, and then desert, although they were in no present peril in our ranks, and not a shot fell near them for days on end? To me it seems to be a symptom. If troops from the Eastern Front are liberated to serve on our front soon, as has been planned, the senilities of the Western War should soon disappear. Those who return from leave no longer find the excitement of the wind and storm, filled with the early enthusiasm and the fresh smell of blood. The affairs of home have gained a greater importance because the war is older. Peace, as a condition, takes precedence of war, while the latter is still going on. We say that we do not think of peace, but at the same time we long for it. And yet there are people who enjoy the war, but they are those who know nothing about it. The archives of reason give good advice on this point to those Americans who want war. Dig a trench shoulder high in your garden. Fill it half full of water and get into it. Remain there for 2 or 3 days on an empty stomach. Furthermore, hire a lunatic to shoot at you with revolvers and machine guns at close range. This arrangement is quite equal to a war and will cost your country very much less. I like the hired lunatic especially. In hospital at Ghent, August 1915. It is quite good for a man to find out occasionally that he can take a nasty knock without quite going off the rails. My stomach still looks like a yellow butterfly, and my thigh like a painter's palette, but I have started to crawl about again. The doctor won't let me get back to the front yet, because he considers an effusion of blood in the thigh as a foreign body. Naturally, I do not agree with him. A big field recruit depot has been installed here. Men of the last class are being trained, and they are shaping very well indeed. They applied for officers from the front at last and actually got a few. These training depots, far removed from home, from relevance and irrelevance, near the industry of the recruit depot, contrasts sharply with the lines of communication troops. The fighting soldier has invented rather a rude name for them. It is hard to understand why these bloated bellies, these plural necks and puffed cheeks, these waggling bottoms and flat feet should be swaggering around in the uniform of a German officer. Why people who regard a horse as the most unpleasant animal on earth, excepting a louse, should wear spurs. If these creatures are really necessary, they should not be invested with an authority that of an officer, which they, barring a few exceptions, abuse as a matter of course. The caste is being dishonoured, and this must revenge itself in some way. Ghent, August 23rd, 1915. To realise the truth that the war is lasting an awfully long time, as you say, is all the more oppressive. One sighs all the more, and feels that one has the right to do so when one is condemned to the endless task of a dam here. And the worst of it is that one dams only stagnant water. Same place, same date. We read about the strength and the capital of the German people every day, but we hear nothing of that particular capital that is going every day, never to return. It is not possible to obtain a true picture from the casualty lists. One should rather calculate how quickly the slightly wounded get back to the front, how many break up without having been wounded, and many other things. It seems that every headquarters, down to the company commander, gives returns of their losses and asks for reinforcements. These drafts, in the immediate communication between the unit in the field and the draft-finding unit, are given over to fresh losses without reservation. Of course, one could give a general a credit of men which he would not be allowed to exceed, but no one perhaps considers the capital of lives, or may in a given instance think of it, unless it be the higher command. Everybody takes it into consideration in secret, but when the order comes from above, we will attack, or the position will be held, it puts a stop to all considerations. Then it costs what it may. August 27th, 1915. The heather is already blooming on the edge of the fields here. The harvest has been brought home by industrious German hands. The trees are losing their leaves, and much of the blue in the land is disappearing. The days are still long and sunny, but a cooler wind is already blowing amongst the warmth. And yet it seems to me as if the oaks had only just got green indeed, as if the year had only just begun. This seems to me to be a disquieting sign for the terrible monotony of our soldiers' life in this immovable spot. The sleep of fairy tales, where no one notices that years and days are passing, is probably the poetical expression. Cologne, September 12th, 1915. It was not too easy last night. I believe I had to hold on to myself tight, and so I could neither say nor do anything. It did not even occur to me to take a last look. Suddenly the other thing came along, and I was thankful for it. It was like a parting to order, or rather to a bugle call. When the bugle call is there, it helps one to speed the parting. Dozing in the night in darkness still left room for other thoughts. But the brightness of the morning is merciless enough to assure me that you are definitely not there. I thought of you and others, that you would again stand alone in all your strife, and that I had not yet thanked you enough, could never have thanked you enough. And then again I had to tell myself that nothing is really happening that we do not both take as a matter of course. West Flanders, September 18th, 1915. How oppressive is this enforced rest? One sees strange manifestations of human nature. Generals no longer get on with their adjutants, whom they praised to high heaven only 6 weeks ago. Minor details of drill are already choking experience of war. The genius loci that rules here is a small spirit, for the genius of the general is not to be seen. I read Schlieffen's essay on this subject. I will do something of this kind again. The evenings are lengthening noticeably, and when I have to keep the conversation up entirely on my own, as usually happens, it is too tiring. This war brings strange disclosures. It has just shown me the value of belonging to a family eugenically beyond reproach. There have been cases of hysteria among men. For instance, a man loses the use of his legs from falling down a couple of steps in a trench. Another suddenly loses his speech and hearing through shell fire. These people were perfectly healthy in peacetime, but their defects suddenly come to light. West Flanders, October 4th, 1915. For it was always so. Man tries to put an actuality in the place of an idea. It is based on the premises of actuality, and therefore works out quite wrongly and disappointingly compared with the ideal. He wants to make dreams come true. The idea that such a procedure might be very bad for the ideals does not enter his head. It is hard for him to bear the fact that actuality is stronger than ideals, and so it is with the war. October 1915. Now we have been lying about here for a year. Nothing is decided. Nothing is ripe for a decision. This perpetual lack of result requires an almost impossible degree of indolence, or a patience that is quickly used up in waiting. The private soldier does not feel all this. For him it is a result of the day to look after his horses, to fetch his oats from the yard, to receive the post, to clean his carbine, and to wash his shirt. How much more easily he is satisfied. This war disappoints many, but were we to disappoint ourselves in relation to it, it would be worse. West Flanders, October 12, 1915. A year ago the first portions of my division, amongst them the cavalry which I command, detrained in Enghien. This memory demonstrates a monstrous lack of decision, a running round in circles, a general futility. At that time the army commander received his troops with the message which read, that to this army of his, which would take Ypres, would fall the whole decision on the Western Front. We will not effect any decision, however small, and though it is undoubtedly praiseworthy to hold this position day and night with weaker and weaker forces, yet this praise is due, mechanically speaking, rather to a shield than to a sword, rather to a siege than to a campaign. In any case, more forced than spontaneous. That is how it looks, properly considered. I don't make things seem worse than they are, but I do not want to make them seem better. We have no grounds for anxiety, but no grounds for hope either. It is a condition of complete uncertainty. October 16th, 1915. Autumn is here. Here come the mists that lie over the land like a raging sea. Swimming in this sea, monstrous bodies arise, drop back and rise again, moving slowly. They are the herds of cattle, and these creatures really seem as if they were still in the throes of the creation, and could not tell whether they would belong to the water or the dry land. Where the sea of mist is not, there are rows of red, violet, and green flames, flickering low down, the coloured leaves of the dying beet fields. And the earth is deep violet. Then comes a row of glowing torches, their fire is gold and yellow, and strews itself in drops of gold on the wet roads. The poplars, whose endless alleys I have so often mentioned as typical of this country. West Flanders, October 19th, 1915. This is the anniversary of my baptism of fire in this war. We lie today hardly 15 kilometres from the place where the first bullets whistled about us. The dead of yesterday lie with the dead of those days in the same monotonous cemeteries. Same place, same date. We are getting ahead very slowly in Servia, as I expected. Elsewhere, not at all. Hindenburg's troops have had to make an uninterrupted retirement of 26 hours in parts. This has not been published anywhere. The rear guard was continually harassed by Cossacks. I learnt this from the letter of a young cavalry officer, von B. Of course, anyone who could read the reports knew already that we had taken the old Russian fortress guns, but that their army as such is intact. October 23rd, 1915. War is a terrible teacher. Whether of good or ill we do not know yet. The education of the individual to the reality which he practices so cruelly does not preclude the fantastic as reality proves itself more and more fantastic than the mind of man can conceive. And yet the war has crippled our imagination. The intellect no longer works freely and independently. One is arrested by an incomprehensible event, as one is hypnotized by the thunder and spray of a waterfall on the rocks. You cannot get away from it, and yet it has nothing more to tell you. You try to see something in it, and there is nothing to be seen. Is mankind in this war only a moraine under the weight of a monstrous glacier? This glacier is slowly rolling down the valley. It never seems to get any lighter. When it no longer weighs on the moraine, when it is melted, only worn-out stones will be lying strewn over a wide field, and they will not really know anything about the glacier. But the stones will naturally raise an even murmur of many voices, for they were all there when the glacier came down the valley. They will all know about everything, and each one will say that what he has to relate is the most important. Such is this war. It is not to be compared with a campaign, for there one leader pits his will against that of another. But in this war both the adversaries lie on the ground, and only the war has its will. At present the glacier is moving southeast, but it may take it into its head to move west, or in some other unforeseen direction. And all of us, Germans, English, French, Russians, and Italians, must move with it. It may be that only one who was free before and who knew what freedom meant feels thus. He made his own life and lived it. He rode on the back of time. West Flanders, October 25th, 1915. A woman writes me that it worries her very much, indeed, it horrifies her, that soldiers in the field should be nothing but material. How clearly it is a law of nature that material should be quickly replaced. That is certainly a fact, but this fact does not justify man in sacrificing material on this account. Probably no one has the sensation of being sacrificed, of being sent into a holocaust in the moment of battle. Now does the individual fight for ideals. He only thinks so in the hours when he is not fighting, but when he is attacking, when he carries his lance or swings his sabre, or grips his rifle with its fixed bayonet tighter, he has an elemental urge to get the other fellow. Then he has no ideals at all. Does he see a rival in the other? Does Cain kill Abel? All this is more probable than any conception further removed from the purely primitive, from a state of nature. None would obey their leaders if we were not in a primitive state. This obedience is certainly not discipline in its deepest sense. It is the primitive instinct that makes one in danger follow the better man. Just as the strongest elephant leads his herd, so the soldier follows instinctively the person of his leader and can do nothing without him. And this is certainly a classic reversion to the primitive. Discipline, on the contrary, is an education to do things in a certain order, a putting of instinct in a leading rein, a perversion, in fact, inasmuch as all attention was directed. To Hindenburg and away from the Western Front, to give an instance. So I do not believe that the individual fights for ideals, that is really in the fight. He strikes out so that the other will not strike. He does not flee because he is fighting in an unrighteous cause. He does not attack because his cause is just. He flees because he is the weaker. He conquers because he is the stronger, or because his leader has made him feel stronger. Ideals do not help him. It is curious what things have seemed suitable as ideals in the history of mankind, and what things are not suitable. Helen of Troy would be unsuitable nowadays, so would Christianity. For the present, the powerful word Vaterland suffices to encourage the German to get himself shot, whereas these same Germans would not sell a pound of the butter that they produce on the farm at home, 25 pfennigs cheaper, however much one appealed to their ideals. And then, does not the war become senseless, discordant, mendacious, when peoples fight for so-called ideals? What is the sense of saying that one fights for Kultur? I do not fight for Kultur in the least, because I hold it to be nonsense to fight for Kultur with weapons in one's hand. I understand the stag who fights his rival for the right of the stronger to possess the doe. I understand the man who murders his enemy. I could even understand a fight for the joy of fighting, but it is not justifiable in the eyes of a thinking man to kill Englishmen, who have otherwise done me no harm, for the sake of Kultur, for emperor and empire, and for national honour. Really, the savage who wonders why people make war and kill each other without wishing to eat each other is quite right. No, I stick to it, that ideals for which one is supposed to fight make the war senseless. It is quite different to unchain a war with them, to keep it going, to bring it to victory. They may be as important as guns. This is the reason for which they are often conjured up hastily and often inappropriately, whether they fit or not, as long as they are there. Then they lead man to the place where he forgets them, eye to eye with his foe. October 28th, 1915. If the world was created from a fiery shape, Flanders is an exception, an obvious patch out of another completely waterlogged cosmos. The wetness is immeasurable. When I write this down, I repeat myself, but it would be doing the wetness an injustice if I did not once again assert that it is immeasurable. No one would believe that God is all-merciful if it were not repeated to him often enough. Same place, same date, winter quarters in the oil mill. The table at which we sit is round. A subaltern who was seconded as ADC at the beginning of the war has come back at last, so there are now 5 of us. With a few candles burning in a smallish room, it is really quite pleasant in contrast to the weather outdoors. The owners of the oil mill, a man and his wife, the children are in Brussels under safe guardianship, are most charming and industrious people. He is losing a fortune through the war, and it pains this active man to see his big factories standing idle, to have ships lying idle in the port of Antwerp, their cargoes having been confiscated by the Germans, and yet to have to pay wharfage on these ships. Neither he nor she allow themselves to get despondent. They do not even have to fight with the rising tide of indignation. She busies herself the whole day, and he does what can be done. The wife is doing her best to make life pleasant for us, the invaders. Without a word from us, she puts fruit on the table readily, as if we were her guests, a few flowers, sews up the split seam of a tunic, sees to our washing, cleanliness and order in our quarters. Today she is making quince jam. One of our company said that he found the smell delightful. She replied that it was a custom of the country to put a fruit among the linen. He said that he had heard something of the sort, and the conversation changed. Next day we found that she had quietly put a quince among his handkerchiefs. All this is done unobtrusively and kindly, not with any familiarity or coquetry. She would do the same for any of us as she did for him. Both she and her maid are of the Flemish type that I always admired. Both very large, heavy and sweeping in their movements, very strong and enduring, healthy and simple, frank and self-confident. West Flanders, November 10th, 1915. One seeks salvation. Being in danger of hurt, one seeks, as always, holy ground. So I hit upon Plato, as a woman happened to write me about him. She seems to need him as an antidote to Nietzsche, otherwise her oracle. So the Superman and the best man stand face to face. The latter is indeed a very flat and inadequate translation of the Greek Aristos, which would perhaps be rendered best by the most distinguished, the most noble, the most highly born. Perhaps indeed with thoroughbred, as applied to horses. Plato wants the thoroughbred, Nietzsche the Superman. Nietzsche wants an exception. He really takes it for himself. His requirement is egotistical. Plato wants the absolute constant unvarying good, the separation of the degenerate, and no exceptions. From the point of view of the head of a state, the Superman is far less important than the thoroughbred on which he can rely through generations. It is very significant that first the Arabians, that is, the most cultivated mathematicians, then the English, who admire everything durable, have bred blood horses, that is, a type of horse bred from a choice of the best with moderate inbreeding, which has the quality of being no longer susceptible to the influence of foreign strains, and does not degenerate or approximate to the local type. 2. Same place, same date. And the war still goes on, and it will keep on. Oh, a long time yet. You look in the glass and find a line by your mouth that is hard and displeases you. You will have to bear with this. It will be on many mouths. 2. November 21st, 1915. Perhaps wars may be won, perhaps this one may, by letters from home. I would rather not use the word lost, for certainly small things also have their invisible effect. Otherwise a general would not be so confoundedly particular, for instance, that the lower edge of the men's caps should be absolutely horizontal, so that when many soldiers are dressed in line, a broad, even, and very tiresome stripe of red faces runs between the parallels of the grey collars and caps, as if drawn with an oily pen. Or he would not get into an ecstasy of curses over an undone button. Reasonable men, good company commanders, can give instruction on this point. These things are important, so they say. The missing button behind the front means a missing bomb in the line. If the fellow forgets his button here, he will forget his ammunition up there. If he has his cap over one ear here, the blade F of his foresight will not be in the centre of the backsight at the front. This is probably right, and therefore wars may be won by letters from home, just as much as they may be won by those perfectly horizontal cap bands and the correct number of buttons. As it is now, one notices the effect of cheering letters. They bring one on a bit farther through the winter and the stagnation. It is easier to be a stone in the Great Wall of the West by thinking how important one is, as only stones in a wall can do. In this way, every human ambition is paralyzed and completely suppressed, and one lives on well pleased with one's stony existence and the satisfaction of annoying the enemy. December 1st, 1915. After a few days of beautiful frost, we have returned to our former condition of complete wetness. Even though the storms behave like raging beasts that sit upon the clouds, drive them down and often fling them like monstrous sacks upon the land so that they splash, yet there are always fresh clouds to bring fresh downpours. One still takes the horses out of the stable for various duties and exercise in spite of the weather, but the happiness of this earth is not on the back of a horse in these times. When they speak anxiously at home of the calling up of the Falstaff Guards, it does not worry me, for the men that you see called up will certainly not be sent to the fighting troops. They will do duty in the supply columns of the lines of communication, and in 1,000 places of which we know nothing. Our regiments, on the other hand, whose losses have only been slight recently, are in very good form, both as regards the men and their training. Work is being done. The officers are a bit young and could be better compared with the men, but we have once more a large number of officers who would do anything. God knows where they come from. For some time it looked very different. December 8th, 1915. There seems to be no doubt about it. There are females in Germany who are bemoaning their fate and wringing their hands because they have no butter to put on their bread in the morning. Yet these same females bear it heroically when their sons are lying in trenches under shell fire. This gives me other ideas on the heroism at home, about which we have heard so much, and gives this virtue rather a rancid taste. December 12th, 1915. In the trenches and dugouts, the men are literally lying in the water. Imagine man and beast, wagons and guns, columns and columns, that pass by continually dripping, that they allow no other thought to emerge except dripping. A permanent dripping is as abominable as a permanent stink, permanent military music, or permanent itching. Then you must admit that it plays its part as an important factor in war. The cheerlessness of the picture adds to the cheerlessness of the event. Nor do people get any pleasanter. They get unjust and curse the war just because it is raining. Then, too, because we know that we have been abandoned by the spirit of the event in its best sense, there comes a moment in war where two forces no longer oppose each other, of which one must be victorious, but when both are so used up that they beat blindly at each other, getting weaker every day, until they both fall down. We feel like condemned men, and though we tell each other that at the first forward, all that which is now dormant within us would arise again, yet we no longer believe that the word will come. Enthusiasm is dying bit by bit. It is losing its resiliency like a spring that has been compressed too long in the same position. That is what distinguishes this war on all fronts, in every theatre of war, the feeling of insufficiency. No one has strength, enough. We have successes, but no success. Never a Sedan, a Cannae, a Waterloo, or a Chemulpo. It is certainly remarkable that neither Germans nor Russians, French, English, or Italians have ever succeeded in overcoming inadequacy anywhere, although there have been hundreds of opportunities. It may be that there is not a single general alive today who knows how to use armies that are numbered in millions. One hears that there are people who can only count up to 3. The Fuegian can count up to 5, as many fingers as he has on his hand. Many company commanders can really only count up to 100, the sum of their cohort. I know men myself who could do anything with 1 regiment, but nothing with 2. And history teaches us that there have been men who could do this and that with 100,000 men, but could not move 300,000. Looking at all commanders, I still believe that Moltke was the greatest greater than Hannibal, Napoleon, or Frederick the Great. It is said that he had luck, but when you look closer into the matter, you find that this is not the case. His plans were upset by the unforeseen, just like others. One must consider how, in the first days of August 1870, one army commander came too early and one too late, how one army crossed the line of march of the other owing to a misunderstanding, to find that he had a way out of every difficulty and that his plans were never threatened by the unforeseen. At Sedan, his army lay with its back to Paris. At Königgrätz, the columns of his army got so tied up contrary to plan that he did not achieve the result he expected until 3 in the afternoon. To achieve his end, he always had a way out, 100 ways out. That distinguishes him from all the others. December 19th, 1915. There was a little hope in the air. Our division tried out a new gas, followed by an attack. But the English received the gas with a hip, hip, hurrah, and the patrols that followed found the enemy positions bristling with bayonets, so that it was unnecessary further to probe the effects of the new means of offence. We lost 1 killed and 4 wounded, besides the lovely gas. Everyone is glad of that. The men do not want to hear the word gas mentioned. They are fed up with stinks. December 23rd, 1915. A military Christmas celebration that surpasses anything imaginable. Orders for a worthy distribution of gifts, sharing out, checking, acknowledging receipt, drawing Liebesgaben, keeping them for men on command and more. Such stuff. West Flanders, December 25th, 1915. Men are strange beings indeed. Those at home make such a fuss about the Christmas feast and Christmas gifts for the troops that one would expect a corresponding effect on those who are most concerned. But when you see the soldiers, dressed in their ranks about the Christmas board, for each man a knife, a piece of soap, socks, cigars or cigarettes, heaped in neat piles, and likewise dressed by the right. It is unfortunate that you have not the slightest idea how they are taking it. You do not know whether they are glad, whether they appreciate the gifts or not, whether they are grateful or not, whether they feel inwardly festive, or whether Christmas did not matter so long as they got knives, cigars, and soap. Most of them seem to take it as though they were entitled to the Christmas gifts, and everything else that is done for them in the same way as their pay and clothing. Their expressions are exactly the same as when the sergeant major is issuing pantaloons, cord, and the happy crowding round the long Christmas table is a padre's fable. Christmas can only be celebrated properly by a few, in their family and their own home. Apart from this, it is so decidedly the feast of children, or for children that grown-up men alone come off rather badly. The Christmas parties that are given in peacetime in the cause of charity already suffer from the mass of those who receive gifts. But to give Christmas parties for soldiers is to murder the whole beautiful idea. So one is satisfied if one can say, "It was quite nice. Well, it really was so yesterday." Our canteen, which calls itself the Hessian Horseman, had just been opened. Its sign represents a marvellous green and white painted dragoon on a spirited brown horse. The tables for the men were arranged in a large room with those for the NCOs adjoining. A huge wreath of ilex, stuck full of candles, hung from the ceiling. At one end stood the Christmas tree. We had taken pains to eliminate everything useless and trashy from the presents, the sort of stuff that is brought to the front in impersonal cargoes by Liebesgaben messengers, as a reward for which these blighters are allowed into the line, the second line, of course. They have lunch with the CO and come home as heroes. After a short speech, all joined with enthusiasm in a cheer for Germany, which is easy to understand, as they cannot raise any enthusiasm for anything else. Then the presents were distributed. The sergeant major had the bright idea of laying the knives, which were a gift from the officers to the men, on top of the piles, so that as many as possible fell down, causing much fumbling about under the crazy tables. For the knives sprang gaily around the room, thanks to their steely qualities. Then 20 men who were especially short of relations and consequently of gifts, each received a sum of money, whereat they clicked their spurs and turned smartly about, as at squadron pay. Then we had a funny lottery for the NCOs, which brought to the surface all their latent humour. That is to say, none at all. For the lottery was not in the book of words. They appreciate beer better than bright ideas. Somewhat later I went into headquarters kitchen, in which the lady of the house was giving her friendly help, and the savoury aroma of a roasting turkey obtruded itself. Oysters strove in vain to resist the opening knife. 2 bottles of Burgundy tried to warm themselves, while 2 of champagne did their best to keep cool. The latter received reinforcements during the course of the evening. A real little Black Forest fir stood in our little anteroom. Real wax candles were burning on an ilex wreath as big as a wagon wheel over the central table. My young subalterns, who have just got their commissions, were resplendent in their new tunics and delighted with themselves and the feast. They had all taken pictures of my horse, and what was particularly charming, of characteristic landscapes, all very nicely thought out and very heartily offered. The schoolboy Johann Bies of Waldholzbach, post Losheim, Kreis Merzig, wrote me a letter in which he expressed the hope that I would return home safely. He enclosed a few apples and a stick of chewing tobacco. Of course, the black soup of the Spartans cannot compete with chewing tobacco. I tried to tackle it last night after the turkey and the burgundy, but found that I was not yet strong enough. Besides, I had had enough to eat, and that is how we spent our Christmas. I do not know whether it corresponds to the ideas of people at home, but it did not arouse such a feeling of antagonism in me as the last one. The first aeroplane and the first war Christmas are different from the second aeroplane and the second war Christmas. The gap between the idea of the festival and the reality was still there indeed, but the bridges that we built last year were still standing. We crossed them as if things had always been so. West Flanders, end of 1915. I do not know whether it is the case everywhere, but here at least there is a certain patrol pride in the guerrilla warfare between man and man, a certain Indian wildness and courage on both sides. I don't know who started it. Not content with shooting up the hostile patrol, they feel that they must bring in the body of the foe they have slain. In the burst of firing that follows the first shots, they haul it back to their own lines as a sort of trophy. The perishers don't bother to report that they have seen this or that. They must have loot of some sort to show. A shoulder strap or a bayonet, or still better, a corpse. To December 28th, 1915. Dearest friend, I should love to send you at least 3 kings like those that came out of the East to brighten your new year. This has always been the homage I prefer. But I have no kings, and if I had any, they would not be holy enough for you. I have only a good word, but I may not fail to express my heartfelt wish that we may all be of good courage. West Flanders, January 4th, 1916. I don't expect that I will have the luck to get to Egypt. It would be for me alone in any case. It is hardly likely that German units will be sent from here against England's throat. Siecht, who is in correspondence with RT here, says that even the English and French in Salonika can be left to the Bulgarians. We do not know yet whether Siecht will be Chief of Staff in charge of these far-off operations. He seems to be one of the cleverest men we have. RT has promised to introduce me to him. The colossal staging of the big synchronized attacks in the Balkans makes one aware of the presence of a very superior intellect. To natures like that of Siecht, it is a matter of indifference if Mackensen is acclaimed by the multitude. Those who understand know that Siecht and not Mackensen was responsible. By the way, there is a German division nearly on the Black Sea, in the midst of the Bulgars. Apparently they are only there for show at present. The men have been issued with new uniforms, the horses are bursting with energy, and they go in for ceremonial parades and bean feasts. I heard this from one of my officers, whose brother is down there. One storm follows another here. The clouds race across the sky, but the pursuer always catches up. He seizes whole herds of clouds and flings them onto the country with one stroke, so that everything is dripping from their downpour. The only shelter against the wind, the poplars round the farms and along the roads, have been pitilessly butchered. Even these poor bits of wood are needed for wretched planks. The whole character of the country has been altered by the removal of these distinctive landmarks. But the war does not care. The front is still. Now and then the thunder of the guns arises in wrath and mingles with the howling of the storms. January 6th, 1916. Speaking of reprisals, it occurs to me again what a deplorable thing is this "I'll do to you what you do to me." How low, savage and brutal is the principle of reprisals. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is somewhat different. Eye is set off against eye, tooth against tooth, and blood against blood. It is not an ethical law, not an ethical point of view. It stood outside of jurisprudence. It was a rule of war, not a law of war. It is justified by primitive equity. Whether one who has blinded another should suffer the same as the inflicted does not rest upon the judgment of man. But this, as you do to me, so I'll do to you, rests upon the judgment of man, and here lies the chief fault. Whether I return good or ill, I begin by reckoning the significance of retribution. The Jews reckon because their God reckons. He is the God of retribution. He punishes and rewards, in retribution. How base that no one should carry his reward within himself? How foolish to punish only for the sake of vengeance? How much freer, untroubled, and affirmative our lives would be were this conception absent. It displeases me even in war. We bombed Reims as a reprisal for an air raid on Freiburg, say the Germans. We have taken the German consul in Salonika prisoner as a reprisal for air raids on this town, say the English. To direct one's attention to revenge is to become dependent on others for one's deeds, and really not to get anywhere at all. January 11th, 1916. I have been thinking lately of making my position a more active one, to make better use of my talents in the field, to get a job of some sort, and so forth. I talked it over with R.T., who certainly commands one of the best battalions on the Western Front. For my first idea was to get an infantry battalion. But what did he say? It is certainly a great satisfaction if one has the luck to have a good regimental commander, not an unpleasant brigadier and useful comrades in the regiment. But look about at the regiments in your division. Some of the very best men, many good ones at any rate, have not been able to stick it, or have gone because they were thoroughly disgusted, if I may say so. You are about the only man who is left to run his own show in peace. Why do you want to surrender your independence in order to be badgered about by some brigadier who resents your not wearing gloves when it is raining? You, with the most amiable of GOCs, you who get along well with him and with everyone? His point of view did not appeal to me as ideal, but he told me that on the contrary, it depended on me. Anyone was useful doing his own job. Do you think that you could bear to see infantry officers riding, said he, to lose your own horses? Be grateful for what fate has given you. Seriously speaking, it really is a fact that the infantry cannot do anything useful or constructive in the trenches unless they are attacking or being attacked. But how often does that happen? An offensive is impossible for the moment on either side. Each of us has learnt a lesson from the other, and should we really ever move forward again, we will be there too. Interior economy, the posting of sentries, patrols in no man's land, have all become unimportant, everyday matters. There is really no point of contact with the enemy. Crawling about on patrol is a kind of sport, and certainly a good thing, like training young dogs. But it is a sport in which I should not be allowed to indulge. To stick out under a heavy bombardment is a virtue indeed, but it is a necessity as well. The chief thing about drumfire is that no one can go backwards or forwards. He would come out of the frying pan into the fire. The only thing to do is to stop where you are, and that requires neither courage nor dash. One's line of conduct is dictated by necessity, so we will stay where we are for the present. I have been reading the diary of Monsieur de Cat, reader to Frederick the Great. One begins to realize how much better our army is, how much braver the individual, how much more imaginative the whole. The so-called old Prussian generals could swear no higher oath than by Frederick's army. They didn't know any better. They have hung a halo on this army, which is quite a good thing. But you would speak differently if you could read these sketches, if you knew that Frederick greeted his runaway troops with the words, "Nothing can be done against cannon." And what sort of guns were they? And then, deserters, looters, brigades cut off, supine leaders, only the king, forever leading patrols and reconnaissances. West Flanders, January 12th, 1916. Leave in sight. I will only be writing once more. What can I write? When one stands on a high mountain, waiting for light to appear in the east, one does not start telling long stories. Buchschlag, January 22nd, 1916. I find everything in fair order at home, more or less in the same place. Gall's little donkey with the big head stands on the writing table and has not lost the power of his hind legs to spurn the assaults of life and of time. I love and respect him for it. West Flanders, February 2nd, 1916. There is a lot of clerical work to be done here now. Division has unfortunately sent in my name for the compiling of a memorandum on the glorious deeds of the Corps. Certainly they are not without glory, but it is more than I can do to write a popular article about them, especially as they seem to me not to be finished yet. They are going to start lectures in Ghent too. Is there any sense in all this? The front has not changed at all. The guns fire on their appointed targets at the appointed time, with the appointed ammunition. Tartarus, which affords eternal bailing with a sieve, and the rolling uphill of a perpetually backsliding stone as torments, could introduce this endless war that repeats itself pitilessly amongst its inventions. February 13th, 1916. Those who saw the 35 English prisoners that were captured in a trench in our divisional sector yesterday had an opportunity of inspecting the lowest and most venal stratum in England's population. There are no such people, Jago would say. Crooked legs, rickety, alcoholic, degenerate, ill-bred and poor to the last degree. If these are Kitcheners, one can understand the effort to get other elements than this venal rubbish into the army by forced recruiting, otherwise conscription. The point of view of not enough was not the only one to be considered. One could feel that not good enough plays a part. There is an immense and significant difference between this crowd and the first regular troops that we fought against in 1914. The equipment was very good, as usual. If one could show this batch in a state of nature to German soldiers everywhere, no one would have the slightest respect for his adversary anymore. The officer contrasted favourably with his men. February 15th, 1916. I realise perfectly the lifelessness of all things about me here, how little there is that is pleasant, and that only the will to be superior to one's surroundings can overcome them. This thought makes one feel objectively, because the subjective takes such a high value. It makes one feel objective towards things, so that one realises perfectly that the bed is cold, that the horses stagger before the storm, that one of them was blown into the ditch with his rider, that one's greatcoat gets torn into tatters. Sometimes the storm blows a cloud of soot down the chimney. Everything is black and dirty, and the fire refuses to burn in spite of all attention. No great significance can be attached to our little successes here. But what Lunzer tells me seems to be worthy of note. He says that the English never come out of their trenches now. That is at once interpreted as lack of enterprise on the part of the enemy. Lovely expression. But I can interpret the interpretation that lazy alcoholics, the scum of East London, are lying opposite us. The better troops, the real troops, are elsewhere. February 17th, 1916. The English communiques deny the loss of 40 prisoners. Not that it really matters either way, but I saw the fellows with my own eyes, and it is rather a poor show if they can say that 40 men are not missing. If it were more important, we ought to publish their names. The 40 Englishmen captured at Pilkham are 1. Captain Perkins, 2. Sergeant I. G. Miller, 3. Private Falstaff, etc. February 18th, 1916. In April 1915, a man of my squadron was killed up at Pilkham. The carpenter made the usual wooden cross for his grave. Orderly and thorough as the man is, he made another cross for stock. It stood about for a long time. When we left Houtholst Forest, it came with us. It is still lying about waiting. There are some very provident souls about. February 23rd, 1916. To get out of the habit of riding is the reverse of refreshing. The day before yesterday, no oats at all were issued for the horses for 3 days, only some maize, and no straw either, only some sort of rushes. By the time we have accustomed the horses to eating nothing at all, they will be dead. The willows that we have been hoping for cannot be used before the middle of March in this country, at least not for horses. The cattle are out of doors day and night, but they have the gift of ruminating, and they must need to re-ruminate pretty often. Although we pull through in spite of all this, we do so with periods of undernourishment. For the present, only the beasts are affected. Later, it will be the turn of the men. I feel that I must record what a brave woman at home said. To her children, "You can read one of Goethe's poems when you have no butter. Other children can't do that." February 26th, 1916. I have a feeling that the attack at Verdun must succeed. Succeed not because of the number of guns and attacking troops, but because of the more general reason that war must be directed in the last resource, not against positions and armies, not against a state, but against human weaknesses. When they appear, there is no more hope. The French are abandoning absolutely impregnable positions. No trip to Rome, no council of war, no talk of glory, and no army order can prevail against that. It may take a long time yet. Of course, this feeling does not portend the end of the war by a long way, particularly against a coalition. Thanks to her command of the seas, England will take less notice of it than anyone. That cannot be helped at present. But when Verdun falls, and I believe, subject to reserves, that it will fall, the Frenchman will lose the butter off his war bread, to say the least, and I doubt whether he will still care to eat it then. On the other hand, we are beginning to feel, as you mention in your letter, that the lot of a German is not an enviable one in these days. That will be true of us, not only today, in the midst of the war, but tomorrow, after the peace or half-peace. I don't know which it will be. West Flanders, March 1st, 1916. I am giving lectures to young officers 3 days a week on the spirit of field service regulations, which is still certainly the real spirit of the war, and also on another theme, the conduct and behaviour of the mounted officer. The lectures are given in Ghent, and the trip there from my quarters at the front is rather a nuisance. The attentive faces of my young listeners are a pleasing sight. The lecture room is in the university. Up to the present, the preparation of the lectures takes up an undue amount of time and trouble. On this point, it is interesting to compare the spirit of the French field service regulations with that of ours. What characterizes the spirit of the German regulations is the following paragraph. Determined action remains the first requirement in war. Everyone, the highest commander and the youngest soldier, must realize that he will incur more blame for neglecting opportunities than for making mistakes in his choice of methods. This is incredibly bold. To bracket the youngest soldier with the highest commander. To demand such a thing from an army of millions. The French cannot imitate us there. Their field service regulations contain nothing of the kind. Such a requirement reads as a matter of course, but one need only consider the course of the War of the Bavarian Succession to see that it was not always thus. Determined action was not always felt to be the first requirement of war. Such thoughts as these are not, I think, useless. March 5th, 1916. It has recently come to light that one of my men by the name of W, who was sent out with a strong patrol on the line Moorslied-Langemarck on October 11th, 1914, was illused and clubbed to death by natives after he had been severely wounded. The patrol was fired on, one man was killed, one horse shot dead, and another wounded. W was shot in the knee and fell from his horse. A sergeant of the patrol tried to bring him along on his horse, but could not get him up and had to leave him lying under the fire of the enemy. As soon as the German patrol had gone, the Belgian peasants and factory hands of the neighbourhood came up, surrounded the dragoon, knocked him about, and went through his pockets. He managed to turn on his stomach. Then a brute who was notorious in the neighbourhood beat out his brains with the butt of his own carbine, which had been taken from him. This came to light through conversations in the Überwachungsstelle at Kortrijk, where suspicious characters are always being rounded up. A peasant had seen it from his house, and a girl, who was standing by at the time, knew the murderer and the thief by name and gave them away. They have been caught. They will certainly be sentenced to death. The peasant and the girl gave their evidence after they had been assured that they would be placed under military protection. At that time, we still had an incomplete idea of the rage of the Belgians. It is a good thing that the charge is only substantiated by the evidence of Belgian witnesses. Otherwise, it would be branded as another German lie. On October 19th, the division went past the point where this man and his comrade had been killed and the patrol fired on. We made haste to investigate, but found neither corpses nor graves. So we thought for a long time that the wounded man had been picked up by the English. Later, various rumours gave us reason to believe, or at least to hope, that he had died in the English hospital at Moorslied on the following day. The reason we did not find the two bodies was that the farmer, in front of whose farm they were lying, sent to the burgomaster early on the morning of the 19th to ask him what should be done with the dead Germans. He was advised to bury them as best he could, and a farmhand dug a hole for them behind a hedge. March 15th, 1916. I have been very depressed since we have been hung up in front of Verdun. Just because I said to myself that a show like the one that was planned there may go wrong. It cannot go so far wrong that we should only take one fort. The French are quite unperturbed. The German newspaper headlines, "Anxiety over Verdun in Paris" and such like, are pure inventions, attempting to twist the perfectly sensible and cool-headed considerations of these people into expressions of anxiety. The offensive has got stuck at its beginnings. If they say now that we did not want any more than we have achieved, that is, to shoot the fortress to pieces, it is simply childish and expects childish credulity on our part. Although the preparation for the attack on Verdun was magnificent and everything ran smoothly as regards the preparations, yet something was missing in the final calculation. A bit of conviction was lacking somewhere, perhaps only at the last moment, as if the sword had been sharpened to too fine a point for this thrust. But really, very fine. For instance, the concentration of 20 corps near Arras, and the sudden swinging round of all this force to bear on Verdun. Then again, the mounting of the heavy guns so as to be able to draw on Metz for ammunition supply. It may be that all this was just not simple enough. Everything is simple in war, but simplicity is difficult. Luntzer has received the Iron Cross for his cheeky patrols at last. As it took division rather a long time to make up their mind, and the decoration was a long time coming, I presented him with a pair of spurs on squadron-mounted parade. He received them with delight, and then, in his richest Cologne dialect, "I'd like to recommend myself for the next go of duty in the line." The rats are a great nuisance in the trenches. One warrior felt himself moved to watch the way in which a rat would catch itself in the trap he had set. But the rat did not want to have an audience and stayed away. The Landwehrmann got tired of waiting, so he lay down on his back and set the trap G on his stomach. Thus he would be gently awakened by the rat scrambling up, and would miss neither his sleep nor the spectacle. Suddenly there was a terrific crack. The Landwehrmann started up, hoping that he had caught the beast. But he flung the trap into a corner, disappointed. It was only a shell that had struck in the board reveating behind him. March 19th, 1916. Spring has come at last and is spreading itself like a cuckoo in the nest, although mankind feels differently about it. One cannot say that it takes precedence of the war. One feels like a man who has been seized by a shark from underneath, whilst the upper part of his body is still above water, and he is supposed to show a smiling face just because the weather is fine. West Flanders, April 4th, 1916. We are still expecting the English. That is the newest news I noticed amongst the same old stuff. To begin with, the hostile planes are very active at night. For this reason, a new darkness has been ordered over the land, and when anyone has to light a match, he holds his hand over it so that he will not get a bomb dropped on him. It is true that our troops had got very careless in this respect, and that hutments, occupied villages and stations were all kept well lighted up and easy to find, in contrast to the practical English, who keep everything carefully in darkness, as our flying men report. West Flanders, April 8th, 1916. I have often had to wait for many and great things, for the clearing up of my own ideas, for 1,000 things, and finally for myself. And yet it seems lighter to bear than the silence behind me, the lack of news and the bated breath behind me. I would never have believed it, and ask myself why it is. It is true. This is no longer a journey to the wars, no adventure that releases a man from everything, leaving him only the foot's breadth of earth on which he stands with his weapon in his hand, perhaps with his horse. We have both bored our way into a rock. Strength and tools are still working forward, striking on impenetrable rock. Only the shaft behind us leads back to freedom and still gives us air. When one hears no sound and feels no breath of air from there for days on end, it gets narrow. Then the rock weighs heavy on one's brow. Then it is cold and dead around. West Flanders, April 10th, 1916. Now and then one finds unexpectedly a silent community of saints that one would like to belong to oneself. Knut Hamsun seems to be such an one to me. Indeed, he does not sit on the mountains, yet in a hermitage on an island. This must be the same thing for him as the mountain is for me. When peace comes, we must look him up on his island. It lies far from the sun. But the attitude of this man seems to me to be all the more remarkable. Same place, same date. Our conduct must depend on the consideration or decision whether we are heading for starvation or hunger. If they can starve us out, any continuation of the war is criminal folly, as we are already convinced of the impossibility of a military decision in the near future. If hunger is all that we have to face, even the hunger of millions, the momentary impossibility of effecting a decision, cannot justify our throwing up the sponge. We will go hungry, all of us, except those without conscience, who I hope will then fall off, like ticks from a dog that has got too lean for parasites. It is true, many of the poor will go hungry. I know it. 2. West Flanders, April 13th, 1916. I wonder whether it is true, this impression that you have brought back from Berlin, that as a result of the war everyone has enough to do to look after himself, and for this reason takes little interest in his neighbour. I rather believe that interest in the destiny of others, even of relations, even so-called friends, was never very great, or was only characteristic of a few. What used to pass for sympathy is all too superficial to stand in the face of present events. Something is changing. What was it then that enabled people to find each other? Not in their cares, in their manifestations and their experiences. When one considers it carefully, does it not seem strangely futile to say of a person that I had tea with him, that I went to the theatre with him, that I had dinner with him? And yet that is typical of what is called knowing him. Indeed, it is not given to everyone to communicate himself so that one gets a share of his innermost feelings. But people have got into the habit of limiting their feelings of sympathy to such an extent that one ends by losing the way to one's neighbour. One cannot tread his paths because they are overgrown. He is hard to find, perhaps rather dull at first, and in any case demands initiative. I believe that the war is only a self-made cloak for the lack or absence of sympathy amongst those who used to associate with each other. Society, as one rightly feels today, is insufficient. It cannot be justified nowadays. Everything was superficial. No one took the trouble to get to know their friends before. Who can manage to do it now? Same place, same date. Still the English do not arrive. Colonel Repington has expressed the opinion that all one could expect from the British Army was to repel an attack in the same way that the French have done at Verdun. And there is no doubt that they would have done so had the attack taken place at Ypres instead of Verdun. So that we may wait a long time yet for Tommy. Falstaff could have argued no better or more gloriously. 2. West Flanders, April 18th, 1916. There is nothing much to be said against the proofs and the picture that you show of declining culture. In fact, it is desperately true. I only find your conclusion false in point of time. There will be a decline. If it takes place within a term of years and not of generations, it will probably be rather fortunate than otherwise. Greater appreciation of one's own handiwork, one's own capacity, one's own art, one's own worth and value. Many may compete to make up what culture and civilization has lost for the moment or for years. It is hardly possible to draw the balance of relative profit and loss now, but it is hardly possible that a decline, like the one that followed the 30 Years' War, should repeat itself. International and national relationships and dependency are too great for that. Even the life of our state is penetrated by too many nourishing saps for that. A woman dressed in rare exotic stuffs, with flowers, with her delicate lace and her jewels as a product of high cultivation and a certain degree of riches, is certainly a sign of inward well-being, one could almost say of inward propriety and morality. The entire absence of these characteristics, the lowering of her personality to the washtub and the cooking pot, is, if insisted on, the sign of inward poverty, or else a waste of values, as if one were to make a fire with beautiful furniture or fiddles, because there was no other wood to hand.